I didn't have any intention of reading this. I've been very aware of him for a number of years, but to be honest, I tend to check out when he goes into the weeds on detail. This book comes with a lot of hype and really good reviews, and I can't resist a book that people are gushing about, so I opted to listen to it, all 17 hours of it. There's no way this man was ever going to write a short book, but I have to say, it was good. It has been a couple of weeks since I've finished it. It's probably a good time to go over the points that have stayed with me. He was a cancer surgeon, he left medicine, he came back to medicine, but came back to work in the field of longevity, which we don't have that as a specialty here in the UK. It's primarily research based, and throughout the book I was wondering, well, who are his patients? Where do they come from? And I think I'm left with a sense he probably has some sort of private practice where they put the findings of the research into practice, and all good, but not something that we've got here in the UK. We'll probably have it in about 105 years time. It's a dense book, and credit to anybody in the medical field that gets through all of this without skipping any bits, because I had to skip past the cancer bits. Why? Personally, I'm just not very interested in cancer. What I mean by that is, it's not that I'm not interested in patients who have cancer, but as a disease, the genetics and the pathophysiology and the treatments of cancer, I just find them all a bit dull. So don't hate. I love this idea of health span versus lifespan, and trying to maximise your health span so that the space between when your health span ends and your lifespan ends is as small as possible. I love this, and I've had this as a concept for a really long time. I've just never been able to crystallise it as succinctly as he does in the book. The majority of the book is talking about ways in which to live to maximise your health span. So he talks about medicine today as being medicine 2.0. We've done great with vaccinations, with hygiene, with treating what he calls fast death. But what has moved into its place is this very slow death from chronic disease. And this is absolutely the space that I work in general practice. My own observations are that when you start to see people in their 40s and certainly 50s, the path divides, and how you live will often determine which fork in the road you tend to take. The good news is, you can cross over. You're not stuck on that train that's going in that direction. Attia makes the case that we should be moving towards medicine 3.0, which takes advantage of everything we know about preventative medicine, screening, and targeting our efforts towards risk stratified preventative medicine. Essentially what he means is preventing the stuff we know we can prevent before it even begins. And he mentions about we only start treating when we've got the tip of the iceberg, when actually beneath the sea is this big body of disease that's been brewing for a long time. He then goes on to talk about the 4 horsemen of chronic disease. I really like this. The 4 horsemen are cardiovascular disease, your heart attacks and strokes, metabolic disease, your diabetics, your non-alcoholic fatty liver diseases, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases such as dementia and Parkinson's. And he really goes deep on the pathophysiology of these diseases, which I loved, apart from the cancer. And if you don't know anything about these diseases, you're going to learn a lot from this book. I was very impatient to get to the chapters on exercise. Now, I didn't need any convincing on the strength data, but what was interesting for me was how convincing a case he makes for cardiovascular exercise, specifically in 2 areas. Training your VO2 max, remember that horrible beep test everybody had to do in PE at school, and zone 2 cardio, which I'm not going to go into because put it in Google and you'll have plenty of choice of where to read about it. Safe to say he makes a very convincing case that we need to prioritise both of these elements of cardiovascular fitness. So, point taken. There's a really interesting chapter on stability, which again made me think slightly differently about strength. and I've already adapted some of my strength classes to incorporate some of his recommendations for balance and stability, because I mainly coach an older population. It was very interesting to hear that he's come back to the comfortable middle when it comes to fasting. I first became aware of him when he was very much an advocate for ketogenic diets and very long fasting for the benefits that it supposedly brings to longevity. However, he states in the book that he now feels the trade-off with muscle loss often isn't worth what you potentially gain from a long fast, and the much shorter fasts that have become very popular, whilst can be good for calorie restriction and weight maintenance, aren't long enough to tap into the research proven longevity benefits of fasting. So I thought that was really, really interesting. There's a large section on sleep. I've been down the sleep rabbit hole before, but if you haven't, then there's lots you can learn about how to prioritize sleep and why it is so incredibly valuable for long-term health. Basically, there's a sweet spot. Not sleeping enough is terrible. Sleeping too much is equally bad. 7 to 9 hours is where it's at. I thought the final couple of chapters about emotional health were really interesting because he shares some of the very severe struggles that he's had in this area, and he makes the point that, again, you have to have things in balance. He's obviously somebody who does things to the nth degree, and that has a trade-off, that has a cost, and in terms of emotional health. He does touch upon centenarians quite early on in the book, which I thought was interesting, because anything I've looked at to do with the blue zones, the 5 areas in the world where people live the longest, these people aren't prioritising their VO2 max. They're certainly not following any particular diet regime. There are themes across these communities which I think speak volumes about how we're living in the West at very fast paced. I also don't know that there's any convincing data that fitness professionals are outliving the general population either, but there may be some evidence out there, I don't know. There are some criticisms in the reviews available on the book that there is no acknowledgement of poverty, and there's very clear data that being poor is about the biggest risk factor there is for having ill health and dying early. However, this book is already very long, and we have to take on board the population that he's mostly working with. I would argue that any doctor worth their salt should know their patient and have skill enough to recognise that if someone's struggling to pay their mortgage and juggling 3 jobs, telling them to train their VO2 max is probably not going to earn you much respect. Overall though, I thought this was a great book, a really enjoyable listen, and I would really encourage you to listen to it. Don't be afraid to skip past some of the really detailed parts if they get a bit heavy. It won't detract from the overall message of the book, which for me is about really considering how you live now if you want to reap the benefits in your later years and maximise your health span. So much of it is within your control. You don't have to live like a high performance athlete, but you do have to make some changes, and just start now because you'll actually feel better for it. Life will be richer and you'll never regret making those changes.